Next up on Innovation Bites, we have Professor Barry O'Sullivan from the Insight Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Data Analytics in University College Cork. Barry, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Barry, for our audience, was one of the early guests on the show when it started 7 years ago. So it's great to have you back on the show, Barry. And it's a lot of water under the bridge. One of the really interesting things has happened. I spotted an article and I really wanted to share it. It's based on Ireland and in Europe in particular, but it affects everyone. And there's so much in this article that is so important for regulation, for European Union, for legal professions. And I always say one of the biggest challenges is the experts don't work in those areas. The experts often work in academia, they often work in the big AI companies, and they're not in the regulation elements, and that is a real threat. So maybe we'll share that perhaps as a starting block, and then we'll tell our audience what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Aidan. A lot of people work in the science side, they work on the commercialization side, but people don't work on the policy side or the regulation. Or if they do work on the policy or the regulation, then they're probably coming from a legal background or whatever, which is great and everything. But you don't tend to find very many technical people working in that area. And I suppose this is something that I kind of identified maybe 10 or 15 years ago, something that was important to do. And I've been spending a lot of time doing kind of policy stuff. And it's really, really interesting and it's really impactful. We need more people who have expertise in different areas to come forward and work in policy and regulation. It's not just something for the legal experts to be working on. The people who know the domains need to be involved in the discussion too.
Absolutely. And one of the things I always like the quote by Elon Musk, not a popular character at the moment in many ways, divisive character. But one of the things that he says about AI is you have to regulate it, pre-regulate it, because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can be in trouble. And that is absolutely one of the things we're going to talk about today, because what we're really talking about stems back to, Barry, you're going to call me an absolute nerd here, but I used to read the sci-fi, and one of the great sci-fi writers was Philip K. Dick, and he wrote a book called Minority Report that became the movie starring Tom Cruise and our own Colin Farrell here in Ireland. And it's a brilliant movie, but it has so many elements of one of the issues that you had spotted at the moment. And I thought I'd start off with a little quote that I pulled from, it's only a 40-page short story by Philip K. Dick. I'm not going to read all 40 pages because this is an innovation bite. But here's a little excerpt. He said in the book, this is the main character, which is Tom Cruise's character, a guy called Anderton, who's the main character, who's the protagonist in the movie. And he said, "You've probably grasped the basic legalistic drawback to pre-crime methodology. We're taking in individuals who have broken no law. We claim they're culpable. They, on the other hand, eternally claim they're innocent. And in a sense, they are innocent." That line is one thing. And then the second is, the basic plot here is that this character is tagged that he's going to commit a crime in the future. So he's arrested before he commits that crime. So it's prevention's better than cure. But there's three precogs, these precognitive entities, these are humans, and two of them say that he's guilty. One of them says that he's not, hence the idea Minority Report. And that is something that is happening in real life today if we use AI for crime prevention. And maybe you'll take it from there, Barry.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there's a lot in that. I suppose AI has been used a lot in sort of policing and justice type settings. For example, in the US, people have heard of the Compass system. So the Compass system is a system that helps judges make parole decisions. And of course, there's been, and it does that using historical data of whether particular kinds of people have reoffended or not. So to what extent have they reoffended, and to what extent they should be given the benefit of the doubt when it comes to parole decision making. And there's lots of evidence that system is racially biased, for example. And of course, there's some evidence that it isn't, and that's part of the difficulty. What does it mean? But the problem is that AI systems always make mistakes, And so, if you're an African American and you're being disadvantaged by the system, that's a serious thing. But even when these systems are even if they are accurate, even if you could perfectly predict the future, the question is whether you can or should use that information. This is the complex sort of interface between sort of artificial intelligence on one side and ethics on the other, and what's the right thing to do. Like at the moment, one of the discussions going on in Ireland is whether facial recognition technology should be used for policing. And so there's some legislation that's been drafted that's championed by the current Minister for Justice Helen McEntee, and so essentially the idea is that as part of this Garda recording bill, that facial recognition technology could be used in policing. And so people might sort of say, well, if you can build, facial recognition seems to be good technology. I open my phone with it, for example. If I have a fancy car, a very modern car, you've probably got in-cabin monitoring that sort of tells you if you're being drowsy or, if you're falling asleep or, this kind of thing, which is helpful. And sometimes, if you're in some airports allow you now to opt to board or to identify yourself with your face, for example. And that all seems okay. But the problem with some of these technologies is what happens when people don't get to consent. So, for example, in China, AI systems are used as part of this mass social scoring system that they have there. So, based on your behavior and so on, you're given a score. It's all very Black Mirror, but it is in use. And so in the Irish context, the question is whether facial recognition should be used or not. And so what does that mean? It might mean that, cameras on the street, as people walk around, it's identifying maybe what people are doing, who they are, and it might be, well, there's Aidan on Grafton Street. We need to get a car over there quick because he's going to get messy. And of course, you're just sort of standing outside Bewley's, mind your own business. So and of course, it might not be someone who's a criminal at all. And of course, fortunately, most people are not troublemakers, they're not criminals. And so you have to weigh up the benefits of these systems versus the risks. And this is where the ethics comes into play. And I guess one of the reasons why facial recognition and policing is so controversial is that the big question is whether the impact of the use of that technology on streets impacts innocent people disproportionately. And so what does that mean? If you knew that camera was on Grafton Street and it was recognizing your face, you might sort of say, well, you might say to your friends, actually, you know what, we won't meet outside Bewley's. Let's go over to Eddie Rockets instead because we know there's no cameras over there. And not that we have anything to hide, but we just don't like the idea of being watched. We just don't like that kind of thing. And so there, your privacy is impacted, your agency, your autonomy is impacted. And so, and while these systems might be able to detect criminals, you as an innocent person, you're changing your behavior because the technology is there. And it's regarded as unethical to do that kind of thing because the balance, the good does not outweigh the sort of impact. Now, of course, it remains to be seen what happens in Ireland. Whether you might say, well, hold on a second, I could use facial recognition to offline, so I could go into, I could go to Dublin City Council and ask them, can I have the recording? Can I have that CCTV, please? And then can I search for a person of interest? And again, it's not clear. That's very different from doing it live. And of course, there's other extreme versions, which might be not so problematic. So here's a video clip of Grafton Street on Saturday. Aidan is on the missing list. Can we find Aidan? Has Aidan been on Grafton Street? And there's all of these different kind of there's a sort of sliding scale of use, but it's a really hot topic. And let's see what happens in Ireland. I and others are kind of pushing back against it, and pushing back not, to, I suppose, ask that we kind of go about this properly and we consult people and we evaluate the options. But interestingly, in Europe, by the time the new AI Act comes into play, it certainly is going to be the case that real-time remote biometric identification will be illegal. So so you have to wonder what the hell is going on in Ireland if we're already started working on a piece of legislation that might be partly out of line with EU rules. But let's see what happens. It's a very, very important area, this whole question of justice and policing and AI. We need to be sort of very, very careful about that.
I wrote an article a while back, and I wrote it, I call it "The World as a Bat Computer," and it was based on, there's a scene in one of the Batman movies where, just like a bat has echolocation, he hacks into everybody's phone in Gotham City and turns all their cameras on so he can triangulate and catch a criminal. And I was like, well, that's what is happening kind of in China, because there's cameras everywhere, etc. But I always thought about that with some of the apps, for example, in the Android Play Store. Some of the apps that do facial recognition are being are used for nefarious reasons. So behind them are some Russian developers or some Chinese developers, and they're taking your facial recognition, your so when it's like morph your face and stuff like this. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. Like I don't really subscribe to stuff like that, but I just think people need to be aware that those things are very possible. And when you're getting an app for free, you're paying with your data, which now is increasingly biometric.
Yes, we all want to find the missing child, but there are exceptions to all of these regulations that allow for these sorts of things. But we can't allow these types of technologies just to be introduced to monitor everybody, regardless of whether they're sort of innocent or guilty, regardless of whether they might or might not commit crimes. Everything has to be proportionate and has to protect your fundamental rights. You're an EU citizen, and that's where the tricky stuff happens. That's where this sort of interface between ethics and AI becomes very, very challenging, and we have to think very, very carefully about it.
For people who are interested in the article, for example, it came out on the ICCL website. Maybe we'll tell people about that and where they can find it.
We've been doing a lot of work. Liz Farris in UCD and the ICCL and other academic colleagues, we've been talking about these things for quite some time and submitting various letters and observations to the minister and so on. And in the last week or so, we've written a letter to the Minister for Justice, and that's gotten some coverage in the media. And hopefully there'll be a way of pointing people to the letter and the ICCL website and various other things associated with this. But it's something that people need to be aware of. And don't be fooled by the fact that, yes, we don't be fooled by the argument that, the police need to have every tool at their disposal to fight crime, because that is not quite true. There are protections there. There have to be protections there. There are protections in all sorts of ways. People can't just simply walk into your house. There's a process for getting access to that sort of stuff, and that's because there are protections needed for your own privacy, your own fundamental rights, and that also applies in technology. And of course, fortunately, the vast majority of people are good, law-abiding citizens. Fortunately, there are very, very few terrorists in the world. Tiny, tiny number. The argument that in order to stop that very, very small group, we need to surveil everybody and do that sort of routinely isn't acceptable. And as one sort of steps away from that sort of real-time dimension, it doesn't necessarily get any cleaner from an ethics point of view. So we have to sort of have that debate about, well, what's the impact of these technologies? What kind of data is there? What do we store? We saw very recently, for example, again, the ICCL had a report earlier this year where they found that people who had been suspected of, sexual crimes, but who were found innocent, their data was still stored in the databases that they were originally placed into when they were suspected, that these databases were not sort of cleaned, that these people weren't removed. And I don't know why that's the case. It might just be that the Gardaí forgot to do it or whatever. But we have to be very, very careful with the data, and that's why the kind of things that we've been calling for, which is consulting with the European Data Protection Commissioner, Irish Data Protection Commissioner, national stakeholder groups and so on. Just having that debate is really, really important.
Fantastic, Barry. And it sounds like we should be looking at a majority report then, rather than a minority report. It's been a pleasure, Barry, and thank you for joining us. And that article is on the ICCL website. And ICCL, for those of our audience, most of your overseas audience, so I better explain that the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. And our guest today is Professor Barry O'Sullivan from UCC. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Aidan.